Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Bullet in the Head from 1990. This is, by all accounts, seems to be a largely forgotten film. This is John Woo's, at least to my knowledge, his most political and most socially outspoken film. And it stands out from the rest of his filmography. And it performed really poorly at the box office. I think it made back less than like a third of what they spent on it, which was allegedly about 3.5 million USD. And on the internet today is hard to find information about, or at least anybody who comments on it generally, unless they're, deep diving into John Woo's filmography. It is unique in that it has a lot of John Woo hallmarks, but structurally and narratively does not feel like a John Woo film at all. It is not what I was expecting. I was expecting something a little different. I knew a little bit about it. I knew it was going to be a little different. What I didn't expect was basically a war epic. And I'm going to avoid spoiling as much as I can. And avoid talking about as much as I can because it's a pretty extraordinary film. It is not without some glaring flaws, but it is cinematically, I hesitate to use the word a masterpiece because that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. It's pretty extraordinary though. It is very different from a lot of John Woo's films, and it's a lot closer to a lot of sort of prestige films. An obvious comparison is to Apocalypse Now. And I don't want to dig too much into that. But because there's a lot of things that I think that unfavorable comparisons that could be made there. Not because this movie doesn't fit to, like, doesn't sort of meet the same level. I would argue it kind of does. But that it may plant too many ideas in one's mind if you watch this film thinking about that one. So I apologize if I've already done that. Please avoid thinking about Apocalypse Now because it doesn't do anyone any favors. However, as far as using some themes and structure, it is a worthy comparison, and the level of cinematic what's the word I'm looking for? The level of attempt is comparable, I think. Obviously, this was a much, much cheaper film than most of, well, I mean, it was apparently one of, if not the most expensive film made in Hong Kong cinema at the time it was made. But compared to what was being made in Hollywood for, decades before, it pales in comparison by budget. And there are some elements of the film that definitely show a lack of that Hollywood prestige budget. But that doesn't mean they don't go for it, and that doesn't mean they don't largely succeed. This continues a lot of thematic things I think I wanted to talk about from the last couple of films, talking in particular about the camaraderie between male characters and the um, emotional vulnerability of so-called heroes, of protagonists and antagonists. It's hard to get into all that without spoiling some of the film, and I don't want to do that. But thematically, so much of this film is interrogating the relationship between friends and how shared experience and trauma and aspirations and adversity affects different people, and how people who find themselves together on so many things can suddenly find themselves opposed or can evolve away from each other. It's also, I mean, I'm not going to get away from talking about this. It's set on the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Allegedly, this was supposed to actually be basically a prequel to A Better Tomorrow, and there are some through lines in terms of characters, but it doesn't actually quite work that way. And even though there are some actors that are shared between the films and that sort of thing, ultimately it doesn't quite work out, even though there are some narrative through lines. Again, that was in no small part apparently due to the other producer on the A Better Tomorrow and A Better Tomorrow 2, basically sabotaging Woo's films and then rushing to get A Better Tomorrow 3, which Woo had nothing to do with, into theaters to basically get ahead of him. What's interesting, there's so many interesting things to talk about in this film, and there's so much to unpack. The film is a little over 2 hours long. Apparently there are some other cuts of it. The version I have was a print from 2010, I think, which is 2 hours and 10 minutes long. Apparently there's some bootleg cuts that are circulating out there that have another like 6 or 7 minutes or something like that, and the original cut is shorter. It's a little bit of a mixed bag as far as the actual like quality of the film itself, but the runtime is interesting because it feels like a longer film than that, and I don't mean that in a negative way. The pacing is impeccable, as is pretty consistent with John Woo's output, but the pacing is very different from a lot of his other work, with a different sort of tonal focus and a different type of story and a different density of story being told. There are the evolution of the film from like the first 30 minutes to the last 30 minutes is fascinating to watch, and it's fascinating to reflect on in full as well, because the first, if you go in with knowing nothing, the first 20 to 30 minutes don't really set you up for don't set up your expectations for what the rest of the film will be like. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. It's slightly jarring, but it's appropriately jarring as the movie shifts from tone to tone, and from location and event, in order to sort of show the arc of the characters as they have the experiences and do the things that they do and make the choices that they make. there are multiple simultaneous arcs, certain ones reaching their climax as others start, and there are elements, an hour or 45 minutes or an hour in the film that then are only setting up things that will become key to payoffs an hour later or more. And it's really, really dense. But it doesn't become muddled and it doesn't become tiring. There's still plenty of John Woo action cinema going on in here, but tonally a lot more of it is about both focusing on the relationships between individuals and the people that they meet, but also recontextualizing of the typical action shoot 'em up stuff that John Woo's known for, in the context of the Vietnam War, a topic that is so dense with topics of its own that I dare not touch it for fear of being here for hours. It's not just a backdrop. The characters are deeply embedded in the environment, and while very little is done to explain, it feels appropriate because the characters are the cinematic experience is in line with the character's experience, where they are in an environment that they don't understand, in over their heads, just have aspirations of their own that are then undermined by the world around them, or that they stumble into certain environments or in with certain people or in certain places doing certain things. And while they may have not have intended to be there, it's very believable the ways in which they react to these situations. They're not, overly confident. They're not too befuddled. They are just trying to get by, and it makes a lot of sense, and it makes the characters all the more believable because of that sort of right characterization, right writing, right tone, and of course the continued impeccable pacing. It is a little hard to align some of John Woo's typical cinematic intent with the framework of a war epic. And I think that makes it all the more interesting and all the better, actually. However, I could understand why this would alienate some viewers going and expecting a John Woo film. In a lot of ways, while John Woo's films tend to be about characters who are morally or ethically questionable, people in crime spheres of various kinds, or otherwise railing against authority, they are typically somewhat celebratory, with the caveat that these people that the viewer should be rooting for based on the framework of the film is somebody who is maybe not a great person, and that concession is made, but that they still have positive intentions and they have a moral code of some kind, and they're not just out for themselves. Comparatively speaking, when you have characters in and between sides of a political and social and cultural conflict in the Vietnam War, it's hard to not that much is done to change John Woo's typical cinematic stylings, but just enough is that it doesn't feel out of place. If you watched a a war scene, so to speak, and it had all the flair and chaos of typical, like the other things that we've watched, these other John Woo films, it might feel tonally dissonant and kind of tasteless. And shockingly, I had no problem with that whatsoever. At no point did it feel like it was celebrating war or like amoral acts, or really even rooting for any given group or side. It was just a different way of filming various war things. I'm shocked at the scale of some of the set pieces they have in this film, especially for the amount of money they did it for. Even in 1990, like I can't fathom how they did all this with that much money. It's really, really very impressive. In line with my comments about the tone still working and not feeling like it's celebrating the wrong things, I think this really deepens some of the sort of narrative discussion that Wu has throughout his works, and his personal views on various political and social issues, and even the nature of violence. I think it's very easy, and often, especially in the 90s and 2000s, there was a lot of small-minded people saying, talking about how violent media was celebrating violence and encouraging violence. And nowhere have I seen a more stark contrast in small steps to between this film and some of Wu's other films, to say, no, violence is not good. We're not celebrating violence here. It's a manifestation of character actions. The way you feel about violent acts going on is entirely contextual to the things around the violence. The reasons that characters act the way they do, the motivations they have for doing the things that they do, and the choices that they make, even more so than the killer. I think that's very, very stark and true here, that the violence feels, while often looking somewhat similar, having hallmarks like the slow motion and over the top explosions and things like that, the tone is just so deeply, deeply different. It's harrowing to watch many, many scenes in this film. At times disturbing. It's a credit to the masterfulness of his direction, as well as the performances and the production, that so different a tone can be portrayed with so similar a style. And I don't want to dig into specifics, both for spoiler reasons and for the sake of not going on forever on this, but if you've watched his other stuff, I think you owe it to yourself to watch this one too. The contrasts are extraordinary. There's a little bit ham-fisted elements in some places, some direct allusions to both historical events in Vietnam at the time that this is set, which I believe is 67. There are basically one-to-one recreations of real-world events that happened. There are also very obvious allusions to some contemporary things that were happening in 1990. The separation of Hong Kong as a former British territory and its big air quotes, return to China is a common topic in multiple of Wu's films, but comes up again here, as well as the Tiananmen Square massacre and the Tiananmen Square riots that had happened fairly recently. And I have to assume this film is banned in China because the allusion is so obvious, even though the actual context is set in 67, that like it can't possibly go over people's heads. Apparently, it's one of the reasons this film got some backlash was because people didn't want to be confronted with national tragedy of that kind. But I think it's deeply important, and it's consistent with Wu's views on issues of power and corruption and political motivation, all of those things that have permeated his other films really come to a fore here. And even if some of them are like really, really overt, they don't seem out of place. They're not done in poor or clunky ways. Maybe a little bit convenient, but not like take you out of the narrative kind of thing. There's so many great elements to this film. I mean, narratively, the overall arc of the four main characters is fantastic. They all have an evolution of their own, and the dynamics between them has very natural changes that are understandable and elicit a variety of powerful emotions. The four leads are all great, and they are all big names of various kinds, or at least notable names. All of whom at least some of whom worked with John Woo before. Some of them have been in some of the previous films, A Better Tomorrow. One was in, or at least one was in Hard Boiled. And I think the rest of them all have had otherwise positive, like productive careers and have become notable names. So Tony Leung, Jackie Chung, Wai-Se Lee, and Simon Yam are all great. The dynamic between them is fantastic. They're incredibly emotive. Their deliveries are just fantastic. Their physical acting, their facial work, their line delivery, just everything about the acting of all four of them is really great. And a bunch of the side characters are equally notable. Obviously, playing smaller parts, not as memorable, but like great performances really all around. There are some script problems and some subtitling problems for sure. I wish there were notes on who does these subtitles. I have to assume this is probably an original subtitle that was tacked onto this release, because clearly the subtitles were only done by one team. There are substantial amounts of both English and Vietnamese spoken in the film, in addition to Cantonese. There's also some French actually as well. And the English subtitles are way off in a lot of cases. Some of the French, what little French there is, some of it is also pretty far off. I can't speak to the Cantonese or the Vietnamese, but I have to, like, some of them are written in really stilted ways. I know I've talked about this in the previous videos as well. and it's worth noting here as well, this is a movie that deserves an accurate subtitling. And I wish I had the ability to do that, but I don't. So we'll have to live with it as it is. It doesn't cripple the film, but it certainly doesn't do it any favors when there's just stilted, weird, not correct writing going on in the subtitles. And it's a credit to everything else in the film that it still works so well, even with some pretty glaring issues. As far as like the cinematography and the visual style, again, like there's some incredible set pieces in here that I'm amazed that they were able to complete with the money they had available to them. I don't know where and how they shot some of this stuff. There's also a whole bunch of interior stuff as well, which I'm sure was done on a stage or a set or something like that. But some of the stuff done in larger open either nature or like big cities or basically bigger settings, open air, are really, really impressive. The cinematography I don't want to suggest that it's lesser in any way. The cinematography is still really solid, minus a few weird edits. But it is definitely a little bit more subdued from the typical, like, highly stylish chaos that Wu is used to. But I think it's totally appropriate. He doesn't lose the feeling of it being a Wu film. It's definitely still his. It's just toned down just enough so as not to sort of upset the narrative tone, being a more serious, more contemplative, more sort of depressing, upsetting, harrowing environment and all these other things that are tonally so different from so much of his other work. As far as like accurate representation of the time and place, I don't know. There's a few stylistic things that I think are probably pretty anachronistic, especially in the sort of the section set in Hong Kong. As for the constraints of the more the war stuff in Vietnam, I'm not gonna nitpick any of the like weaponry or gear or anything like that. It's just not worth the time, and especially for the budgets. But there's a few things that I go, don't feel like that's quite right for 1967. But I don't know. The music is pretty solid throughout, but so I'm thinking about the sound mixing in general. There's some moments when the sound mixing is a little rough, but generally it's pretty good. It's generally pretty consistent with a lot of the rest of Wu's work. The composed music is also generally pretty solid, with the exception of a few ambient tracks that I think are a little too they're a little too farty synth, and it feels very 90s. It feels like it dates it a little bit because it feels like a like 80s or 90s action film soundtrack at certain moments. I just think that's aged poorly. I don't think it's like necessarily that obtrusive or doesn't ruin anything. But in contrast with like the main theme of the film and some of the other compositions, like that's a little disappointing that there's some other good stuff in there that gets offset by it. Yeah, I mean, overall, this is really not what I expected at all. I'm genuinely really impressed. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch it sometime for sure. I think if you are interested in action films, Hong Kong cinema, even I wouldn't call this a war film necessarily, or even a Vietnam War film, but it's got enough there that's like, I don't think you would want, if that's all you're looking for, you shouldn't watch this, but like, it's still a pretty incredible piece of work. And under the circumstances which it was made, and for the amount of money it was made, like, this is really incredible. It's got plenty of flaws, but I don't think they're really worth picking at that much. It's just a pretty darn solid, impressive, like, film beyond the scope that I possibly imagined it would be. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist. I'll see you guys next time.